African also don't take research seriously. Our work is data-driven. We want to understand what existing narratives there are about Africa and understand and analyze the impact of these narratives. Today we're speaking about the power of stereotypes. It's my honor to introduce my fantastic panelists. First off is Adam Khan, Senior Lecturer at University of Bath, and he's also one of our partners at African Filter, carrying out interesting research. Second is Yannick Lefebvre, co-founder of Cassie Insights. Excited to have you on stage. Thank you so much. Please have a seat. So we're going to begin with you, Adam. You've done extensive work. You're an expert in stereotypes. I mean, can we begin by exploring why stereotypes exist?
Sure. So thank you for inviting me to this wonderful event. It's an honor. So to understand sort of the basic process of why we even stereotype or why we do it, you have to imagine if we all look out at the world and we didn't use categories, we'd all just see color dots, right? That's all we see. So the way we make sense of our world is we categorize those color dots into schemas and things, and then we can retrieve information from our long-term memory and say, this is a chair, this is a person, this is a stairway that I can walk up on. And we do the same with humans. So in order to navigate in our social world, we categorize people into groups. You know, this is a woman, this is a man, this is a black person, a white person, a European, an African, to then derive information about how to interact with them to make sense of our world. So that's the basic processes. And now, in the process of doing that and learning about categories, there are a variety of biases that happen sort of naturally. For instance, the first one is we tend to generalize more about groups that we don't belong to than about groups that we belong to, right? So if you met a Kenyan and they were nice to you, you wouldn't be like, oh, Kenyans are nice because you're a Kenyan. That's not a diagnostic. But if you met a French person and they were arrogant to you, you'd be much quicker to say, oh, French people are arrogant. So we draw conclusions about other groups that we don't belong to much quicker because that's sort of what we want to do. We want to know what other people are like in our own groups, our diagnostics. So that leads to this first problem that's called outgroup homogeneity. We think other groups are more homogeneous because we've constantly drawn conclusions about them than our own groups, and we think our own group is so diverse, but other people aren't. That's the first process. And then, of course, the information we get is fed to us by the media, so that's being talked about here extensively. The media is portraying things negatively, but it doesn't even end there. So there's more biases on the way, not to only talk about the negative stuff, we hopefully talk about positive stuff too, but when we draw these kinds of information, so when we meet people around the world and then we draw information, Africans are like this or like that, that process isn't statistical learning. We don't draw information from every interaction we have. Instead, we draw conclusions from information that stands out. We call that information that is salient, that grabs our attention. And in our world, fortunately, negative information is more rare than positive information, right? Even the most criminal country in the world has more people who aren't criminal than people who are criminal. So if you see a person being criminal, that is very diagnostic. So that's more likely to make you draw a conclusion about a group than if you see something positive, right? If I saw an African having lunch in London, I'm not going to be like, oh, all Africans have lunch, because there's no diagnosticity in that, right? Like everyone has lunch. But if I see someone steal something, I'll be much quicker to say, oh, that whole group must be people who steal. And so if you put that in there, that's sort of what we're up against if we're fighting stereotypes. It's not just that we homogenize and categorize around people, it's also that that information is based on whatever stood out. And statistically, that is more likely to be negative.
Thank you, that's quite nice. Yannick, and I'd like to draw upon what he's talked about, we are more likely to draw negative stereotypes upon other people. And the extensive work you've done on Africa with data-driven insights. What do you think, from the work that you have done, what is the impact of harmful stereotypes on the person?
Thank you for the invite. And it was a short one. I wasn't supposed to be here, so I'm glad to be here. And really blessed to be amongst creatives. So I'll answer the question in two angles. Definitely there's an impact on the stereotypes that have been applied to Africa and to blacks in general. When I look at the stereotype, and I'm going to start with Africa versus the world. We know how the world is viewing us and how it has a negative impact. When you look at investments, FDI on the continent for indirect investments, only 2%. When you look at investments, across in Asia, for example, is 20%. So definitely those stereotypes have impact on us. But I want to draw, the attention on, one story, which is, I read a book, talking about how the British missionary were describing some people in 1850, and they were describing them as, lazy, partying all the time, not thinking about the future, very really hopeless. And if I ask you, who do you think these people are? Chances are you probably think Africans, but these were Japanese in 1850. So, and I want to draw that because I think we need to understand that those stereotypes that we are sort of witnessing today, if the ones who are categorizing us like that will go back in their own history, they will find themselves at the same stage at one point in time. And so we also need to, think about, and I think that's how we can respond to those stereotypes now. The second aspect I want to answer is, which I think is the most important one, is Africa versus Africa. Because we've been categorized and because we've sort of integrated these categories, we don't also do business among ourselves. And so if you look at intra-Africa trade, I think it's 14%. If you look at Europe, it's 60%. And I think that's where the big opportunity is when it comes to stereotype. If I ask an Ethiopian what he thinks about all Africans, not necessarily also very positive. So these stereotypes that have been imposed to us by the external world has an impact on how we see ourselves within the continent. And I think we need to start, again, shifting that narrative in terms of, these stereotypes to engage amongst ourselves, because I think that's where we can flip the coin and really have a big opportunity for the continent.
Thank you so much. How do you think, just before I move on to Adam, how do you think we can begin to actually shift those stereotypes? Because it's one thing to say, there's no intra-trade in Africa, but, we also have to take into account the many barriers.
Yeah, absolutely.
That exist.
So, the interesting about stereotypes and actually how we need to shift the narrative on the continent. Funny enough, it doesn't cost a penny. We need to change our mindset to begin with. How do we look at ourselves, and how do we look at our peers and our fellow Africans? I think that's the first thing. We need to know each other, which means gathering like this. I think very important. We need to be open-minded, and we need to be aware again of self-awareness of these stereotypes. And I think it's very, very, very important. And that doesn't cost a thing. We live on the wealthiest continent on earth. And again, I'm going to tell you another story. If you think about the castle of no return in Ghana, the story about that castle is a story that this is the last point where slaves were leaving the continent to go in America or wherever. The story that is not told about that castle is that castle was built by the Portuguese because they were doing the gold trade at the time, and it would take them a month shipping from Europe to Ghana. They would trade the gold and then they would go back, and it would take another month. There was a month lag in between, and because at the time they were fighting with the French, the Spanish, they did not want them to actually take that opportunity to come in and grab that trade. So they decided to build that castle so that they could trade permanently, stock the gold, and then ship it back. So that castle, my story of that castle is that this is probably where probably one of the most of the wealth of the modern world was generated. And so that's how I see that castle. You can see it as this is where slavery was going. I'm seeing it as this is probably where a lot of the wealth in Portugal, in Europe, has been generated. And so we need to start also looking at, these stories and trying to really understand that we live really on probably one of the most blessed continents on earth, and we have to understand that, and we have to integrate that, and look at our history, with that lens.
Thank you for that. And Adam, I want to come back to some conversations we had initially, not so private, but private, with the initial data that you had around stereotypes, and when you were asking people, what's the first thing that came to their minds about Africa? It wasn't the African people.
It was the animals.
It was the animals. And I think that's tragic because that's also another level of dehumanization. We are erased completely. So here we are battling with two things. We are battling with stereotypes, but we are also battling with people who don't even think of us in existence. So when you think about stereotypes, because how do you even begin working against that? Because one of the things I do, which I think is wrong, is when someone says Africa is this way, I'm like, Africa is not, but I end up sort of like affirming what they're saying, So how do I not do that? How do we counter harmful narratives? First of all, for people who don't even think we exist or care for us to exist. Yeah.
Okay, a lot of questions in there. I'm going to try to work with one at a time. So the animal thing, I think, is it's interesting. It was surprising to me when I first read it that that's what people are saying. We've since run more studies, and what we generally find is when people think of animals of Africa, that is not correlated with other dehumanizing stereotypes. So people do think of Africa as poor. They think of Africa as a land devoid of resources, which is incredibly paradox given how much exploitation of African resources happens in Europe and America, that on top of that Europeans think of Africa is a place that doesn't have resources, the average person. But the animal thing doesn't seem to be going with that. So the more people think of Africa as a poor place without resources, the more they think it's politically unstable. But that's unrelated to the animal thing. That's related to a rich culture, a beautiful place, a place to travel. So at least subjectively, the people's perspective of Africa being a continent for animals is a beautiful, rich continent that we should visit. Now, whether on some other level that is still dehumanizing, that the Africa's beauty comes from its animal and not from its people, that's something we can discuss, but people subjectively think of that as a positive thing. So that was your first thing about the animal. I want to, all the other things, what do you do to combat, that was your other question, right? To combat harmful narratives. So, I feel like this is not a room I should lecture about how to change narratives, right? If anything, I'm here to learn that. So obviously you change the stories, you change what's being told. I think taking into account some of these psychological processes might help. For instance, this process of attention and salience. So if you start telling a lot of stories about how Africans are average just like everyone else, there might be good intention behind that, but that's not likely to be noticed, right? So special stories work better because they grab people's attention. So as much as sort of that might be a pragmatic and sad perspective to always grab people's attention, if sort of you're from a pragmatic perspective, you want to change stereotypes, you want to tell new stories that people haven't heard. And then the other thing about not reinforcing stereotypes, so negating stereotypes famously doesn't work. So if you tell someone women are not weak, they'll remember women and weakness is something that goes together, right? And so in the same way, if you tell people Africans are not poor, what sticks is Africa and poor seems to be mentioned a lot in the same sentence. So you have to talk about the wealth of Africa if you want Africa to not be poor. If you want Africa to seem stable and organized and forward-thinking, you can't keep talking about, oh, Africa's not a backwards continent. You have to talk about how Africa is a forward continent. So negating stereotype is the way to change stereotypes. It's not the way to change stereotypes. It's giving people counter stereotypes, and that works on many levels. First, it's attention grabbing. Like if people see something they're not expecting, they're more likely to pay attention and integrate it. And also, it saves you from reinforcing those associations between Africa and negative things. Simply go around them, like sort of. Don't even try to fight them, just tell a new story. That's sort of the more effective way from what my research suggests. We'll have to see in the real world.
So I love that. So just a reminder, you can't counter harmful narratives by negating them. You have to crowd in new stories, different stories. And I think that's fantastic. Yannick, from the data that you have and the work that you've done on African behavior, which I think is fantastic, how do we then begin changing how we think, even on the continent? Because are we even aware from your data and insights that we have some negative and harmful stereotypes within ourselves continental-wise and just even regional?
And I think that's the challenge, right? Because from our data, we did study around. By the way, we run about 11,000 interviews across 20 markets every month. We've done this for 5 years now. We've done a study, for example, around travel and looking at where would people travel if they were in Ethiopia, in Kenya, what would be their favorite travel destination? As you can imagine, majority will want to travel outside of the continent versus inside the continent. So I think having that story is one thing. Then you have to publish it now to sort of raise the awareness. And now you have to now work on how do we enable those, let's say, who thinks Kenya is a good destination to continue to travel to Kenya. And I think that's the step that we have to do. We've always been very surprised. Another study we did, also, in the continent was around sort of the Russia-Ukraine crisis, where again, you see Africans basically willing to help in terms of donations, in terms of, these are not the stories you would hear in the media, right? And so people don't even ask us when things like that happen because our opinion usually doesn't matter. So what we do is, we ask people every month what they feel about these issues, because their voices is as relevant as anybody. But I think what we need to do more of is how do we disseminate that story so that now we have in the media, across the continent, but also the world, these viewpoints. And again, as we're saying, having that positive narrative about the continent and really telling the reality of the continent, which is factual, from a geographic perspective, from a cultural perspective, from a, this continent is really blessed as a continent, and so we have to tell that story. And as he said, if you're telling a story of a wealthy place, if you're telling a story of a prosperous place, you're more likely to have those stereotypes. And it can happen. I mean, we've seen that it really can happen. We just have to do a better job at telling these stories and changing the way we look at the continent and how we then talk about the continent as a result of that.
And I'm about to put you both on the spot because I'm about to talk about the cost as a final question, the cost of narratives. Because it's one thing to talk about, yes, we all know there are harmful stereotypes, but if we are able to assign a cost to it, it's still early days, Adam, no panic, but I know with our research, but if we're able to assign a cost to harmful stereotypes, what effect do you think that may have in how we can tell stories about, this is the actual cost, even if it's not a number, but this is the actual harmful effect of harmful stereotypes, What do you think, or how do you think that could help in shifting conversations when it comes to the continents? And I'm going to begin with you, Yannick, and then end with Adam. Adam is going to kill me. He's like, we're not there yet, Natasha, but yes.
I mean, I guess I'll start with the intra-Africa trade because I think that's where I see the biggest cost of opportunity. Like I said, there's only 14% of trade that's happening within the continent. If we can get that to 50%, if we can get that to 60%, we will be definitely more prosperous. And so I think that's one number that we should be looking at, because when you look at traveling, when you look at tourism, when you look at commerce, when you look at all of these things, again, the fact that people perceive Europe, America as a better destination has a significant economic cost. The fact that if I ask people in Cameroon what good furniture is based on the origin, they're more likely to tell me it's European furniture than Cameroonian furniture has a significant economic cost. And so we've seen with our data that when you think about consumers and you think about drivers of purchase, we're not the same across. And so again, based on whether you were colonized by French or British and everything, or how far you are in your journey, right? You see consumer behavior when it comes to purchase decisions being different, and it has a significant impact on cost. If you look at, and I'm going to close on that, if you look at companies that are doing very well on the continent, right? They're more likely to be global brands than local brands, right? If you then take the stereotype that we have and just map that We haven't done a study or research around that, but I'm very sure there's a positive correlation between those two. Now, if you flip the coin, Kenya, I think between 80 and 90% of clothing in Kenya is second-hand. I mean, just think about that. If you bring that to 20%, and now you have local brands selling to Kenyans, you tell me what the economic impact of that is. So there is definitely a significant impact. What really spending the time to work on it and shifting that narrative.
Thank you. I think, does anyone have President Ruto's cell phone number? Adam, we're going to conclude with you. We talked about the costs. Do you think that could actually change conversations? If we're able to say, because of this, then you need to invest differently on the continent. Yeah.
So, I guess to bring everyone in on Natasha's joke, so the project we're doing together is to try to put data to the fact that stereotypes have negative consequences, and it's proving a little harder than I was hoping to show that stereotypes have actually economically harmful consequences. So, but on a psychological level, I can talk about why I sort of believe in the project and think that it's true, and that's before everything that Yannick says. So of course, you're going to buy the products that you think have higher quality. So if people think African products have lower quality, they're not going to be as likely to buy them. But you can also go back and see, so where does that image come from that African products have lower quality? And if you think of a place of people as sort of helpless and unagentic, then you're going to be less likely to think that they produce new and amazing things, because they're sort of unagentic people who probably copy things from Europe, so why not buy the original? So sort of there's a direct psychological consequence, there should be. Again, we're trying to put the data on it, but that if you see a place as, in stereotyping research, we often distinguish between warmth stereotypes, how much you like someone, and competence stereotypes, and Africa very much seems to be low on the competence side, even for people who like it, because they like it for traveling there and seeing animals, right, but not because it does things. And so that will make it more likely that people don't think products coming from Africa are good, because they don't seem to be coming from people who are good at what they do. And then in terms of collaborating with Africa, if you think of a group of people as not agentic and poor and stuff, you're going to be more likely to engage in what we call dependency-oriented help. So you give them things to help them because you think they're helpless without you, and then you hope they do things with them, and then when you leave, that help is gone too. And the kinds of things you want for an economy to prosper is what we call autonomy-oriented help, to do investments so that people can take them and become even richer with them and do more things with them. And again, those stereotypes don't seem to promote autonomy-oriented help, right? If I constantly see images in the UK, anywhere in Europe, in the US, of starving children, then the type of help I'm going to want to give is dependency-oriented help, right? I want that kid not to starve, and then I'll leave, or I'm going to continue, giving them £1 a month because that's not much money for me, and then they'll survive. But that's not the kind of help or cooperation you'd want for Africa to prosper as an economy. And so, trying to think of a good finishing line. So,
Thank you so much. And on a very light note, narratives are shifting. Nairobi was recently crowned the most beautiful city to visit, to the shock of Nairobians. We take it anyway. Thank you so much for being with us in this session, my wonderful panelists. Thank you. After you. Thank you.